essentially, as part of work package and task 3.4, which we'll discuss this afternoon, we went out to stakeholders in terms of a survey about potential user requirements. And really, we were looking at combining the proxies from tasks 3.1, 3.2 and 3.3, but we're trying to get an understanding of what those user requirements were to inform the design for our demonstration software, which actually we'll be presenting this afternoon in our Work Package 3 session in terms of our dashboard design demonstration software work, which will run for the next 18 months. So essentially, we put some survey work out there, and I'll run through both the questions and responses. But first of all, just to get an idea, it was perhaps slightly vet heavy. And RAFT being embedded in a veterinary organisation, there is probably some vet bias in this group. So it's probably worth bearing that in mind in terms of the responses. But we had a mixture here of vets, farmers, advisors, research scientists, as well as going into some of the wider breeding and cattle community. So there is some veterinary bias in this composition, which is worth bearing in mind. So we asked a series of questions really about herd level monitoring data. And the first one of these questions was, we just asked which monitoring data would the respondents find the most useful in their work. There's maybe some surprises in here and some things that aren't surprising. I think the first thing is that reproduction comes out very strongly, both in terms of the veterinary and the breeder part of our user group, perhaps not surprising. Milk quality in terms of mastitis, again, very, very strong. We were slightly surprised that economics was so low. You know, the fact that economic monitoring was only had one respondent was surprising. And again, we had quite a lot of the efficiency parts of this, again, perhaps weren't understood, but we certainly had a dominance of responses that were quite clinical, quite animal health based in terms of reproduction, mastitis, nutrition. Again, I'm very happy to take questions as we go along if people want to shout out as well, because I think it's probably the only way to do this. I won't be able to see responses. The second question, really, we then tried to understand about frequency of data use. So we asked a series of questions about the timescales. So the first question, we asked which data users would like to deploy annually. Again, reproduction is very high, and now, interestingly, longevity, productive lifespan starts to become more important in terms of that annual strategic use. And again, we see resilience is being articulated. Economics is still low down on the list, but certainly now longevity and productive lifespan as an annual indicator was quite popular. We then asked the question about quarterly. So if we were actually deploying these data in a quarterly fashion, reproduction is still high, mastitis and health indicators were still high. Longevity, productive lifespan and resilience slightly less kind of frequent as we move away from kind of annual strategic view into more of a kind of quarterly picture. Economics still low. And then in the same way, we looked at monthly. Again, reproduction very high, health traits very high, longevity, productive lifespan, and resilience now less frequent in terms of their their kind of use and employment. And then finally, in terms of weekly, again, we see a dominance now of those health indicators, and even reproduction has dropped back. Production of milk solids, milk quality therefore, and key health indicators, and things like lameness, mobility have gone up. And then lastly, we looked at daily use. And I think this is where, again, you know, production and milk solids becomes the most frequent selected, with still health traits being very high, and now those longer term indicators such as longevity, productive lifespan are now not very frequently selected. So, you know, some thoughts there about how we would use data in driving decision making, both in terms of the frequency that our stakeholders would suggest they would use them. So we then sort of moved on to some discussions about format and integration. And I've got about another 5 slides, so I'll go through these and then perhaps take maybe 5 minutes of questions or a few minutes of questions if that's appropriate. So from that discussion about how frequently stakeholders would want to use data, we moved to format. And we've been trying to feed this information, by the way, into our dashboard design plans. So what format would we prefer to use herd level data outputs? So PC and smartphone, we've really taken those as being the 2 preferred formats. And that's what we're taking forward in task 3.4, really to try and have a dual functionality as smartphone and dashboard. Social media page, we thought might have been higher. Email notification is still there. We did still look at paper reports, telephone calls, but essentially this looked like a fairly strong preference for both smartphone and a dashboard application on a PC, perhaps in the farm office or the veterinary office. We had to ask about payment. Being in a veterinary background and trying to understand how farmers might pay for services and whoever would be delivering this commercially, we asked what frequency, perhaps a leading question, at what frequency would stakeholders prefer to pay? We had a preference for monthly, and we have experience of monthly subscription services for data reporting at RAFT. So monthly was a preference, although a significant group did still discuss annual payments. Interestingly, that some of the stakeholders felt that they're paid to do it, so they wouldn't pay for the service. They felt it was something they would be providing. The added value comment, I think, is interesting too. If there was an added value to that, they would be willing to pay for it, but not if it was just producing the report. And then my favourite one is have a try for a few months and then pay if they wanted to carry on, which try before you buy is the phrase that we tend to use. And then we looked at system compatibility. And I'm very conscious here of country differences between systems that are being used. So again, there is a bit of bias here in terms of some of the veterinary software systems, but hopefully some familiar names in terms of Uniform, Agri and Dairy Comp. But again, you know, a real mixture. You know, milking parlour software and compatibility with milking parlour software is perhaps an important message. If farmers have already paid for software and they're already entering data through their parlours, then that seems quite a strong connection. But again, you know, familiar kind of firms here, which a wide compatibility is perhaps a strong message coming away from this. And then in terms of access, last two slides now. So who we asked stakeholders who they'd like to give access to. So again, benefit to farmers either giving themselves access or vets being very clear that farmers should have access. So farmers and vets and other advisors really come out of this very strongly. Access for researchers, I think, was still very positive. Access to government was quite a low frequency of response in there. And again, there was one response, which is that they wouldn't want to give access, that it's something that they would want to keep protected. So finally, just a few free text comments. So I think perhaps following up some of the discussions from yesterday, this was quite a dairy-based survey and some feedback again about beef farmers perhaps feeling that these systems don't speak to them very well. An acknowledgement that there is some veterinary bias perhaps in how this is answered. I think discussions again about sustainability are very important, and some crossbreeding feedback. Confidentiality, making further point about permissions and therefore control of access. And then really also looking at a perspective really on small populations and therefore annual usage in terms of breeding evaluation work, and linking these things together with existing technologies with both AI companies and also kind of precision engineering. And finally, perhaps the most important, the request that the device should be practical and simple to use by unexpert users.